The first sip of coffee was always the best, a quiet ritual on my own front porch. But that morning, the steam rising from my mug met a far uglier vapor, the acrid smell of fresh paint. My eyes, still bleary with sleep, followed the scent of the roof. And there it was, a grotesque, sloppy gray slash across the gleaming black surface of my solar panels, the paint still glistening wetly in the early sun. My heart dropped into my stomach. Vandalism. My mind raced. Teenagers, a random act of spite. Then I saw her, Betty from 3 houses down, the HOA's most zealous enforcer. She wasn't skulking away. She was standing proudly on my lawn, one hand on her hip, the other still clutching a long-handled paint roller, dripping gray onto my freshly cut grass. She looked less like a criminal and more like a conquering general surveying a captured fortress. "Betty," I managed my voice tight. "What in God's name are you doing?" She didn't even flinch. "Rectifying an eyesore, David. Those things are a blight on our community's aesthetic. The uniform roofline clause is very clear," she said with the unshakable conviction of someone who believes bylaws are handed down from Mount Sinai. This wasn't just about solar panels. This was the culmination of years of low-grade tyranny. Betty's reign was built on a foundation of meticulously typed violation notices. For a trash can left out an hour too long, for a mailbox painted the wrong shade of eggshell, for the unapproved species of petunia in my wife's flower bed. Our neighborhood, under her watch, had become a pristine, soulless diorama of conformity. My solar panels, a symbol of progress and independence, were a direct challenge to her control. She hadn't just issued a citation. She had taken a paint roller to them in broad daylight, an act of such breathtaking arrogance that it short-circuited my anger into pure, unadulterated disbelief. The chaos began not with a shout, but with the wail of a police siren. I'd called them, of course, but Betty was ready. She presented the officer with a printed copy of the HOA covenant, certain sections highlighted in violent yellow. "It's a covenant violation," she insisted. I was merely enforcing the rules. The officer, a weary-looking man named Jacobs, rubbed his temples. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you can't destroy private property because you don't like how it looks. That's not enforcing a rule. That's a crime." The real explosion happened as the sun rose higher. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered on the street. They saw the defaced panels. They saw Betty being read her rights, a truly glorious moment, and they saw the fragile illusion of her authority shatter. The dam of resentment broke. Mr. Gable from across the street started yelling about the $200 fine he got for his non-regulation garden gnome. Sarah Jenkins waved a sheaf of papers, detailing her 2-year battle to install a wheelchair ramp for her mother, which Betty had blocked as structurally incongruent. Betty's act of petty control didn't just destroy $20,000 worth of my property. It exposed the petty dictatorship for what it was. It was the single spark that ignited a neighborhood revolution. By noon, a petition was circulating to have her removed from the HOA board entirely. By evening, a local news van was parked on the street, its spotlight illuminating the ugly gray stain on my roof for the entire city to see. My solar panels were ruined, a silent, paint-slathered testament to one woman's pettiness. But as I stood there, listening to my neighbors finally find their voices, I realized her paint roller had accomplished the exact opposite of what she intended. It hadn't enforced uniformity. It painted in bold, sloppy strokes the picture of her own downfall. The chaos she left behind wasn't just a mess on my roof. It was the beautiful, noisy sound of community waking up and taking its power back. And that, I thought as I took a final cold sip of coffee, was worth more than all the sunlight in the world out of course. Here is the expanded version of the story, focusing on the character of Karen and the escalating conflict. The neighborhood already had a name for her, whispered over backyard fences and in group chats. Karen. It was a title she'd earned not through any single act, but through a relentless, low-grade campaign of control. Brenda, the HOA president, was a platonic ideal of the stereotype. Her mornings were a patrol, a slow, critical cruise in her spotless white SUV, her eyes scanning for infractions like a hawk searching for field mice. A lawn dare to grow 2 inches too high. A violation notice. printed on heavy cardstock, would be in the mailbox by noon. Children's laughter echoing from a sidewalk bike ride, she'd appear like a specter to remind them of the safety ordinance against reckless pedestrian interference. Her reign was built on a foundation of meticulously documented petty grievances, and the neighborhood existed in a state of pristine, soulless anxiety. But above all else, Brenda's biggest pet peeve, her white whale, was anything that threatened what she called the neighborhood's aesthetic. This was a vague, ever-shifting standard that existed solely in her own mind, and at the very top of her list of aesthetic crimes were solar panels. To her, they weren't symbols of clean energy or financial prudence. They were grotesque, industrial scabs on the beautiful, uniform shingles of her domain. They represented individuality, a concept as foreign to her as a dandelion in a perfect lawn of Kentucky bluegrass. So, when Mark, a pragmatic engineer who lived on the corner, installed a sleek, low-profile array of solar panels on his south-facing roof, it was more than a violation. It was a declaration of war. The panels were so discreet, they were barely noticeable from the street, but Brenda noticed. She saw them immediately, and her jaw tightened. They were an affront, a rebellion that could not stand. Her first move was bureaucratic. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived armed with printouts and a furrowed brow. She argued that the panels created a glare hazard, that they were structurally unproven, and that their non-conforming appearance would plummet everyone's property values. But Mark had done his homework. Calmly, he cited the State Solar Rights Act, a law explicitly designed to prevent HOAs from banning renewable energy installations. The board, wary of a legal fight, reluctantly sided with the law. Brenda was defeated, outvoted, humiliated in front of the very people she sought to control. This public rebuke festered inside her. The sight of Mark's panels, gleaming in the sun each day, became a personal insult. She grumbled to anyone who would listen, her complaints shifting from the practical to the unhinged. "They're sucking the sunlight out of everyone's gardens," she claimed at the community mailbox. She stewed in her own resentment, her sense of order deeply violated. The legitimate channels had failed her. The rule of law had failed her. In her mind, this left only one option: direct action. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. She saw Mark leave for work, and something in her snapped. The months of simmering fury boiled over into a reckless, arrogant resolve. If the law wouldn't uphold the aesthetic standards, she would. She marched to her garage, not to get her car, but to retrieve a nearly full can of thick, gray exterior paint and a long-handled roller. In an act of breathtaking audacity, she set up a ladder against Mark's house in broad daylight, climbed up, and with broad, slashing strokes, began defacing the panels. This wasn't a stealthy act of vandalism. It was a performance. She was the enforcer, the guardian of the aesthetic, making a public stand. She painted with the self-righteous fury of someone utterly convinced of her own moral authority. Completely oblivious to the fact that she wasn't restoring order, she was about to unleash total chaos. Of course, here's the expanded version of the story, incorporating the pivotal twist. The audacity of it was what stunned the neighborhood into a temporary, disbelieving silence. It wasn't the cover of darkness. It was a sunny Saturday morning, under a brilliant blue sky. As Mark drove off to run errands, Brenda, Karen to everyone, emerged from her house with a stepladder, a heavy bucket of slate-gray exterior paint, and a roller. She marched across the street with the purpose of a general, not with the skulking gait of a criminal. To the neighbors sipping coffee on their porches, the scene was so surreal it was difficult to process. Was Mark having his roof repaired? Had he hired Karen? The idea was ludicrous, but her actions were so brazenly public that it created a moment of collective confusion. That confusion was all the time she needed. By the time old Mr. Gable from across the street finally registered what was happening, the deliberate, broad strokes of gray paint obliterating the sleek, black surface of the panels, it was too late. Karen worked with furious, efficient rhythm, slathering the thick paint until every last shimmering square foot was covered under a dull, ugly coat. She descended the ladder not with guilt, but with a sense of profound satisfaction, wiping her hand on a rag as if she'd just completed a righteous chore. Mark's return was met by a small, shell-shocked group of neighbors gathered near his driveway. Their worried faces pointed him toward his roof. His heart plummeted. The $20,000 investment, his pride in reducing his carbon footprint, the years of energy savings, all now buried under a layer of malicious, hardening paint. The violation was visceral. He stormed across the street, his knuckles rapping sharply on Karen's door. She answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting. She stood there, arms crossed, a smug, defiant tilt to her chin. Before he could even shout, she spoke, her voice dripping with condescending triumph. "They were an eyesore, Mark. They don't belong in my neighborhood. I fix it for you." The sheer arrogance of the statement took his breath away. But then Mark's anger, white-hot and blinding, crystallized into something colder and more purposeful. A grim smile touched his lips. "You fixed it?" he repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Brenda, you have no idea what you just fixed." What Karen didn't know, what she had been too self-absorbed to ever inquire about, was the true nature of Mark's system. It wasn't just about powering his own home. For the past year, Mark had been the pilot participant in a groundbreaking community microgrid project, backed by the city and a state green energy grant. His panels were the first node, the anchor, feeding excess power not just back to the utility, but directly to 5 other homes on the street during peak hours, stabilizing the local grid and lowering costs for his participating neighbors. Her act of petty vandalism hadn't just destroyed his property. It had single-handedly sabotaged a publicly funded initiative. As Mark pulled out his phone and called the police, he also called the project manager from the city's sustainability office. Then he turned to gather neighbors, his voice clear and carrying. "Just so everyone knows," he said, his eyes locked on Karen's suddenly uncertain face. "Because Brenda decided to pay my panels, the microgrid is down. That means a guaranteed rate protection and backup power for the Gables, the Jenkins, and the Ortega families are offline effective immediately." The mood on the street shifted instantly. This was no longer just about Mark versus Karen. This was about their wallets, their energy security, and a shared future she had willingly destroyed. Karen's smug expression melted away, replaced by a dawning horror, as she realized her war on an eyesore had just made her an enemy of the entire block, and quite possibly the city itself. Her petty victory had lasted less than an hour, and the fallout was only beginning. Of course, here is the expanded version focusing on the critical community security aspect. The true, breathtaking depth of Karen's ignorance wasn't just that she failed to read the HOA reports. It was that she actively prided herself on ignoring what she deemed technical minutiae. While she obsessed over the precise shade of beige for fences or the acceptable curvature of a garden hose, the actual, substantive work of running the community, the budgets, the infrastructure, bored her. She attended meetings to enforce aesthetics, not to discuss kilowatt hours. And so, the most critical upgrade the neighborhood had undertaken in years had sailed right past her, a fact that now hurtled them all toward chaos. Years ago, the HOA had invested heavily in a perimeter security system. Sleek, automatic gates at the entrance, a network of high-definition cameras on lampposts, and motion sensor streetlights that bathed the streets in a soft, safe glow after dark. It was a selling point, a promise of safety. But that promise came with a staggering and ever-increasing annual electricity bill. As power costs soared, the HOA fees dedicated solely to keeping the lights on and the cameras recording had become a painful burden for everyone. Mark, an electrical engineer by trade, had seen a solution. When he installed his panels, he proposed a symbiotic relationship. His system would generate far more power than his household needed, especially during sun-drenched days. He offered a feed that accessed directly into the security grid through a dedicated line. It was a win-win. The HOA's energy costs plummeted by thousands of dollars a year, and Mark received a modest credit against his own fees. The proposal was detailed in 3 separate memos, voted on and approved unanimously by the board, minus Karen, who had abstained, calling it a dull financial matter, and had been lauded as a stroke of genius in the quarterly newsletter, a document Karen famously tossed straight into the recycling bin unread. Her paint attack, therefore, wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was an act of infrastructural sabotage. The first sign of trouble was subtle. As the sun began to set that evening, the bright, steady LED lights on the automatic gate flickered, then dimmed to a sickly orange glow. An hour later, residents checking the community security app on their phones found a chilling sight. One by one, the camera feeds winked out. First, the view of the playground went black. Then the entrance gate camera. Finally, the entire digital map of the neighborhood surveillance system displayed a blanket of ominous gray NO signal icons. Panic, cold and immediate, began to spread. Texts flew through group chats. Is the security system down? My app isn't working. The gate light is flickering like something from a horror movie. The sense of insulated safety, a core part of the community's identity, evaporated in minutes. It was Sarah Jenkins, the treasurer who had championed Mark's proposal, who first connected the dots. Standing on her porch, staring at the dead camera on the corner lamppost, her mind raced back to the brazen scene she'd witnessed that morning. Curran, the paint, the solar panels. Her blood ran cold. She picked up the phone and called Mark. Within the hour, a crowd had gathered outside Karen's house. Not just a few curious onlookers, but a genuine, angry assembly of homeowners. Mark stood before them, not with rage, but with a grim, factual tone. He held up his phone, displaying the blank security app. Brenda's little home improvement project didn't just destroy my property, he announced, his voice cutting through the anxious murmurs. She single-handedly took our entire security system offline. The panels power the gates and the cameras. She painted over the power supply. The fury that erupted was white-hot. This was no longer about one-man solar panels. It was about their children's safety, their property values, their peace of mind. Karen's war on an eyesore had blindsided the very community she claimed to protect, plunging it into literal and figurative darkness. Her smug victory had lasted less than a day, and the price of her petty control was about to be paid in full. In the warped theater of her own mind, Karen had cast herself as a hero, a lone guardian of purity standing against the tide of unsightly modernity. As the gray paint dried on Mark's panels, she felt a surge of righteous victory. She had taken a stand. She had fixed the problem. The reality, however, was that she had not been a hero protecting a community, but a vandal who had just declared war on it. The fallout was swift and merciless. The HOA board, typically a circle of her allies who rubber-stamped her petty decrees, found themselves in an impossible position. This was no longer about an unapproved mailbox or a rogue garden gnome. The community's entire security infrastructure was dark. The automatic gate, now powerless, stood permanently open, a silent invitation to any passerby. The camera feeds, once a source of comfort, remained a grid of ominous gray blanks on everyone's phones. The immediate invoices weren't just for cleaning or replacing Mark's panels. They were for emergency electricians to reroute power from the grid at premium cost, for security consultants, and for the terrifying prospect of a full system replacement. The anger of the homeowners evolved from shock into a cold, calculated fury. It was one thing to dislike a busybody. It was another to have your family's safety compromised by her arrogance. Threats, once whispered, were now formalized. One neighbor, a lawyer, drafted a letter outlining a potential class action suit against the HOA and personally against Karen for gross negligence should any property crime occur during the security blackout. Another, whose home had been burglarized years prior, stood at a hastily convened emergency meeting and spoke with trembling anger about the trauma of violated privacy, a fear Karen had recklessly resurrected for the entire street. Mark, meanwhile, was methodical. His police report was a masterpiece of detail. Vandalism, criminal trespass, and destruction of property over $20,000, a felony-grade offense. But the most damning element was the connection to the community grid. Because Karen's act had damaged a system that was legally tied to communal property, the district attorney's office took a keen interest. She wasn't just facing charges from an individual homeowner. She was being investigated for damaging public infrastructure, a distinction that carried far heavier penalties. The smugness drained from Karen's face, replaced first by stubborn defiance, then by panic confusion, and finally by a pale, stunned horror. The world of HOA bylaws she had mastered was a small, contained pond. The world of criminal law and civil liability was a vast, terrifying ocean. Her friends on the board, fearing their own liability, publicly demanded her resignation. Isolated and cornered, She had no choice but to step down. The legal consequences were severe. To avoid a potentially devastating criminal trial, she accepted a plea deal that included probation, community service, and a restitution payment that amounted to tens of thousands of dollars, covering not only Mark's new panels, but also the HOA's emergency expenses and legal fees. The final, exquisite irony came a few months later. With the full and enthusiastic blessing of every single neighbor, Mark installed a new solar array. It was bigger, more efficient, and with a state-of-the-art battery storage system that ensured the security grid would never fail, even at night. The new panels, more visible than the last, were no longer seen as an eyesore. They were a badge of honor, a symbol of community resilience, and a very public monument to one woman's catastrophic miscalculation. Karen, now just Brenda again, had to watch from her window as the very technology she sought to destroy was celebrated. Its sleek, dark silhouette against the sky, a permanent reminder the day her petty reign came to a crashing and deserved end.